All right, I'm glad to get to present to you today. Unit testing is something that's really important to me and my team. Share my screen. So yeah, as was said, I'm the development manager in application services. So I manage a team of 13 developers at InterSystems working on 15 different internal applications at InterSystems that are Iris-based, full stack applications. And we also maintain great open source projects on the Open Exchange and GitHub. So I've been building applications on Iris for like almost 15 years now and writing unit tests for maybe 13 or 14 of those. It's really valuable being able to have automated tests of your application and your code so that you don't need to manually test absolutely everything, and you can build automation around that. As you add more and more tests, you're able to prevent defects from entering. So our agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about writing unit tests. The PowerPoint's a little sparse. I'll do some demos off and VS Code to the side. How to actually run your unit tests, things to do and not do when you're writing unit tests, how IPM makes everything easier, and then how you can close the loop on measuring if your unit tests are actually any good or not, in part using one of my team's open source projects, the test coverage tool. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And I'm very interested to hear your perspectives on unit testing in Iris and see if we can share some knowledge. So for writing unit tests, the Iris documentation is, of course, excellent on this. The basic concept is you have a class that extends %unittest.test case. You add instance methods to your test class that start with the string test. You run your code under test within those methods and make assertions about the results. So what this would look like, we'll add a class that extends %unittest.test case. We'll add a method test something important. And we'll say do assert equals, and then you'll have, suppose I have, this wouldn't be in the same class, but thing being tested as %integer that returns 42. And you'd run your code under test and assert that it produces the correct result. There are a few of these assertions. There's assert not equals, there's assert failure, assert success, which would assert failure would be something went horribly wrong. We shouldn't have gotten to this point in the code, and we want to provide some information about that. There's assert files same, which is really useful if you have a complicated output that given some simple input, is a large file that should have very specific contents, and you would compare that to some reference file or stream. There's assert status okay for methods that are returning a %status. Might be a couple others too, but those are the ones that I would use the most. So now we have our unit test. How do we actually run this? At this point, I want to interject with a warning about source control. The key point is don't shoot yourself in the foot. There are two modes. Source control, other than unit testing, is one of the other things that I really care about in Iris development. There are really two modes for this. The client-centric control, where the code and source control very naturally is on the developer's machine. If you're using VS Code in kind of the standard mode, this would be how you're operating. I think more common is for people to develop against a remote Iris instance, possibly multiple people developing against the same instance. And that means that all of your code and your source control is on that remote Iris instance, because otherwise you have a bunch of developers with their own local copy just stomping on each other, trying to send things off to the remote instance. I know there are features in VS Code that make it not quite that not quite that dangerous, but it still is a confusing state of what is the source of truth actually. So in VS Code, this would be achieved using the ISFS mode. If you're using Studio, this is still, for some reason, this is kind of the mode that you're naturally in. And you need to have some kind of source control set up on the server, because running unit tests will by default delete the unit tests after they run. So if your code is just on the server and you say run my unit tests, then you're possibly in trouble. So just make sure that you're using source control properly. I think in the journey toward mature development on Iris, source control comes before unit testing. Anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, running unit tests, you set this magical unit test root global to the path to the unit tests on your file system, and then you call the run test method in %unittest.manager. So here I can see my unit test root is set to this folder under a local Git repo that I have, and I'll do #class %unit test.manager.run test. And this takes just a minute. It's going to run a bunch of different tests, and then I can see some results in the management portal for these tests. And we'll look at that. Well, actually, I ran them a minute ago, so we can just pull that up.
Tim, there is a question in chat.
Oh.
I don't know if you see it, or I can read it for you. So the question is, delete the data generated during the test, or delete the code associated
yes.
with the test?
So if you're, it would delete the code associated with the test. So this class is, the expectation is it is on the file system, it's loaded, and then it's deleted after the tests run. And that just, it's cleaning up after itself. The idea is you could, it's just cleaning up the code. The data generated during the test is not deleted, and we'll actually talk about some ways you can deal with that in a bit. So all right. So if you go to System, Explorer, Tools, Unit Test Portal, and I'll switch over to proper namespace here. Oh. All right, we'll just switch to sys. I can see all suites passed. I can see the test suite is unit test /source control /git, and all of my unit tests for this Open Exchange package are in unit test.sourcecontrol.git. So within that test suite, I can see the names of my classes that exist. I can see how long it took the test to run. And I can drill down on one of these and see the specific test methods and then the specific assertions within those. So moving on to some do's and don'ts. I think it's important to name your unit tests well, rather than naming them after like a issue or some code change identifier that makes it really non-obvious what the unit test is actually related to. If you have a unit test that's really testing the behavior of a specific class, naming it something like unit test dot the full name of the class being tested. And if you have so many tests that a single test case gets unwieldy for that, you might break it down into a package with that name, unit test dot the full name of the class that's being tested dot some subcomponent of that class. Or if you have tests that are at more of a functional level across really, maybe might call these more integration tests than really focusing on a specific unit of code, but really exercising a broad functional area of the application, just making sure that your unit test class name reflects what's actually going on. And that means that when you're looking at the unit test output, looking at specific things that failed, it's easier to get back to, okay, what actually caused this? One thing that I've worked on 3 very different teams that have all used %unit test, and each of them has ended up with a project-specific subclass, or maybe a hierarchy of these even, of %unit test.test case. And what that allows you to do is move common assertions of your own that might be dependent on specific classes in your project, utility methods to help set up and tear down data, and there are methods that you can override from %unit test.test case on before all tests, on after all tests, to do things like set up and clean up data. Another thing that we've done to the point of the question about does the cleanup data created during the unit test, we have a subclass of %unit test.test case that on before all tests starts a transaction and tracks, because all of these tests are instance methods, we can track in a property of the unit test class what the initial transaction level is, which should always be 0. And then on after all tests, and to be extra safe, in %on close as well, the destructor for the object will roll back to the initial transaction level. So what that'll do is say any data that is created during the test will be cleaned up at the end. And you can do that on before tests and on after all tests. And that's a very reasonable thing that you might want to say, I want all of my unit tests to do this, or be able to do this optionally, perhaps controlled by a class parameter. And you would want to define that in one place rather than needing to define it separately in every single unit test that wants to use that. Don't forget to make meaningful assertions. So you can exercise your code that's under test, but if you don't actually make good assertions about what the behavior or side effects are of the code that you're exercising, you're not going to catch regressions. As much as possible, avoid making tests that are highly data dependent, because the data underlying it, in your persistent classes, etc., might change, and you want to be sure that your test won't be invalidated without there being a regression at the code level. And don't rely on developers running tests manually. As much as possible, automate running your unit tests and notifying developers if something goes wrong. We've used a number of things for this. We use Jenkins on my team and other places in InterSystems. GitHub Actions can see in a bunch of the projects that are out on the open exchange. And that helps provide notification to developers within their workflow if they've accidentally broken something. Also, another do is, as for me as a manager, when we have a unit test that catches a regression, it's really good to make a big deal and say, this is why we have these. And over the past couple of weeks, I can think of one case where a unit test caught what would have been a regression that I think otherwise would have been missed in just plain code review. And it would have been pretty impactful. All right, I'd like to pause for questions here because
there is a question for you from Flavio on the chat. Can the unit tests be done with the classes made in Python?
So with the unit test classes made in Python, or unit testing of other classes that have methods with language equals Python? I've not tried writing a unit test class that has. Yeah, that's a really good question. Ultimately, all of those assert macros are wrappers around instance methods from %unit test.test case. I don't think they are. All right, if I wanted to do that, I think what I would do is use this concept of a project-specific subclass of %unit test case, and would maybe write some wrappers around the different assertion macros, because the macro, of course, you can't use the ObjectScript macros in Python. So what I might do for something like that, and just to be clear, I'm a diehard ObjectScript developer, so I'm going to embarrass myself by trying to live write Python. But we'll say assert equals I mean, so if we say language equals Python, and then right. There we go. All right, so let's just see if that works. Someone who knows Python, I'm embarrassing myself here, isn't it? Well, anyway, something like this, I would see, because this is like a wraparound dot dot assert equals via macro with a bunch of things, and you'd want to do something like this in your base unit test class that you would then extend, and you could write your unit test methods in Python. Question about regression testing UI components and so for regression testing of user interface, I would say it depends. This works really well for business logic that's within Iris. %unit test is probably, depending on what UI technology you're using, there are other tools that you would use instead of this for regression testing the user interface. I know we've used Cypress for Angular UI. We've used Selenium for more general user interface regression testing, but that's heavier weight. All right, back on script. So the way that you have generally run unit tests is you set this unit test root global, and if you're working on a whole bunch of different packages or projects in the same area that have their own sets of unit tests, this is just a little bit annoying because you need to point to the right place. In the package manager world, given that you might have multiple packages that you're working on against the same Iris instance, we have in the package manager shell, you just run your package name test. So Previously, I set this global to a path that I happen to know, and then I called run test. I can equivalently say CPM get source control test. And what that will do is reload the entire package, compile it, and then load and run the tests. I can also say test dash only to say just run the tests. And this doesn't have the same level of verbose output. I could also add the dash verbose flag to say show all that output. So this is right now just including write statements from my tests. And of course, I now have a test suite failing because I added that silly thing that did Python wrong somehow because no, not really a Python developer. So the other, yep, thank you, Evgeny. You can also say test package name. That's the same thing. So this just makes it easier. In this case, what we have is in module.xml, we've defined, we have a unit test resource. The name is the folder. There's also just information about what the package is. And this is needed because if you have a whole bunch of things that are, a whole bunch of packages that are running in the same Iris namespace, then when you uninstall a package, we need to be able to get rid of all the right classes. So that's just how we keep track of this. That's why you also need the package name in there. So then the directory structure would be, we have our test folder and then directories corresponding to the package names and then classes within this package. And there could be sub packages as well. That just works. And then last thing I want to highlight is how can you tell if your tests are actually any good? You can note when they catch what would have been a regression, but that's kind of hard to measure. So one measurement of are my unit tests actually any good is seeing how much of your code base they exercise. And one of my team's open source projects is a tool that does exactly that. There's documentation here, but the short of it is instead of doing ## class %unit test .manager .run test, you just say test coverage .manager run test. It'll run your unit tests. There was a question about, well, while we're waiting for this, there was a question about how you unit test a REST API. What I would generally say is your REST API should be a very thin wrapper around, for the cases that there is business logic there, your REST API should be a very thin wrapper around that business logic, and you would unit test that. The other thing you can do is just have a unit test that makes a %net.http request to that REST API, perhaps set up in a slightly different security context or manner for purposes of unit testing only.
Actually, Tim, I would follow up on that. The question is that sometimes we, and very often when with ObjectScript, we code this business logic, and actually we are building the REST API, right? And if you refer to other languages, for example, like Python with the DB API, with Python, the unit test techniques in Python expect that you will literally query this REST API via unit tests. So unit tests really do the requests.
Yep.
Do we have such techniques, and do we provide anything like that to really act with HTTP requests to the REST API built on Iris?
Yeah, so we don't have any libraries around that other than you just have %net.http request to make an HTTP request. So for my team, we have some tests of REST APIs that work like that. and we might do some things under the hood to like create a fake session and use it in the request. Or we will just unit test a level lower. So and just say we know not actually go through HTTP. So one of the challenges, as we're talking about test coverage, one of the challenges is if you make an actual HTTP request to a REST endpoint and you're trying to measure your test coverage, in general, we're just interested in things that are happening in the process that's running the unit tests. And if you make a web request, it's going to obviously be handled in a different CSP worker process. So you're not going to get your test coverage credit there. So the short answer is there's a mix of approaches, either using %net.http request or calling a level lower, not actually going over HTTP. So back to test coverage. I can see that test coverage is not actually great for this package, but we'll just go here. There we go. And I can drill down and see within this class, these lines are not covered. Under the hood, this is using the line-by-line monitor programmatically. And some lines actually would never show up as being executed by the line-by-line monitor, like one that just has a closing bracket or a try statement for some reason. So you don't get dinged on those. So I can see these two lines were run by the unit test and the rest of these were not. And there are a number of options there. This is one part of this is we have a file called coverage.list under the unit test root that says what are the classes that we care about measuring test coverage of. And you either need to define one of these or at when you call the unit test manager, the test coverage unit test manager, give it a list of things, which is annoying. So I would recommend having one of these files if you're going to use it. So that was the last thing I wanted to highlight. I do see another question. Is there a framework ISC recommends for mocking? So there's a bit of a story there. We have something that we've built and been trying out internally across a couple development teams. I'm currently working to try to get that out there. So stay tuned on that. Hopefully this year, I can't make any promises, but we have something that's very similar to Mockito, where you can say within the scope of this unit test, when I call this class method, do this other thing instead of actually running this class method, or give me an instance of a class that none of its methods actually do anything within the scope of this unit test method. So for those who haven't heard of mocking, the general idea is you want a unit test to be exercising a unit of code and not a network of and external systems that you're connecting to over HTTP requests and different things like that, where you want to test, does this unit of code work, not does the whole picture work? And you might even say, you might have dependencies that could fail in different ways, and you can't actually, within the scope of the unit test, make them fail. So you either need to rewrite your entire code base to use some kind of dependency injection, and there's not really a dependency injection framework for ObjectScript, or use mocking to say, within the scope of this unit test, a great example is when I send an email, instead of actually sending an email, just kind of snag the email that would have been sent so that I can make assertions about the email that would have been sent. And mocking will let you do that. I feel like we're too early in that process for me to give any demos on that right now, but I am trying to get that out there. Any other questions?
There are a few questions in the chat. Can we test HL7 inbound and outbound?
I would love for somebody else to comment on that. So I personally don't do anything with HL7 or healthcare interoperability. So if someone else on the call has ideas on best practices for testing that, I would love to hear.
Next question is how to debug the unit test.
So there are two ways that I'll tend to do this. One is let me just pull up the docs. So if we look at the class reference for %unit test dot manager, when you call run test, there is a debug option. And what this will do is run the unit test in debug mode, which causes a break if a test fails. So you're running in terminal, a test fails, it'll break. And you can look at the state of things. I kind of think this isn't always at the right stack level. So if I'm debugging a unit test, I'll often just throw my own break statement in the unit test, run it in terminal, and then inspect variables and the state of everything. This is especially useful in that use case I mentioned where we have a base test class that wraps everything in a transaction, because if it's not leaving any evidence of the data behind, you need to actually get into the execution of it. Another thing that we will commonly do in our base and the base test case class that my team has, we have a run me class method that'll basically say, come up with the test suite for this test class and the test case and call debug run test case. And this would not load the test case. So you could target this class method very easily in the debugger and then just set breakpoints and do what you normally would in the debugger.
Tim, can I follow up on this?
Yes.
Actually, this is very exciting method. It would be great if you can share in an article or somewhere.
Yep.
But the one of the annoying thing I meet is when I have a test case, like a test suite of 100 tests, and something goes wrong with the test number 56, and I just it has more than one line. Yeah, so I just want to go through. I just want to run the test case 56 and debug it. And this is not obvious how to do this rather than just run everything and yeah.
Yeah. The short of it is you either manually do what's in here. If you're in an IPM setting, I'll send a link to this in the chat. If you're in an IPM setting in your test command, you can similarly say, this is the only unit test case or even the only unit test case and unit test method that I'm interested in running. So you don't run the entire suite that takes 2 hours. You just run the one unit test that you're trying to fix.
Nice.
So this is how it works. And this is an existing developer community article, clearly. But that's how it works in an IPM setting. From a general %unit test setting, you would be calling debug run test case, and you need to figure out for your test class what the test suite is, which is this expression, and what the test case is, which is just the class name. And then the test method is optional.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Thank you.
All right. Enrico said, unit test delete the unit test code / classes by default. Can this be changed? Yes. So when you call run test, you can say, you can add the /no delete qualifier. This is not, this is only a problem if like I think I might have implied that it's easier to shoot yourself in the foot with this than it really is, because the expectation is your unit tests are already on the file system. I think it's more just that it's annoying from a development workflow perspective if you're in a server-centric workflow, and also just highly frightening if all your code just disappears. So running with /no delete will do it. If you call debug run test case, that's, I believe, not going to automatically delete either by default. Any other questions? I'm glad that we had some extra time.
I've just
Today.
shared the lib ICDF, which contains class method that helps to to have a unit test for dashboards and pivots in InterSystems. So for example,
Cool.
like a regression for everything. So and basically what it does, it runs all the queries in pivots and dashboards, and if they cause errors, so fine. Yeah.
There was a question from Enrica also that you mentioned that unit tests delete the unit test called classes by default. Can this default be changed?
Yeah, so I did cover that just from the flag in the run test method. I don't know if there's a way to change the default behavior. Yeah, need to check under the hood on that. There is like $system.obj.set qualifiers, but I'm not sure if you can use that for actually changing defaults for unit tests specifically. And Enrico's happy, so that's good.
All right. Any other questions? I'm also scrolling chat in case I missed something. Feel free also to unmute and just speak if you still have any questions. Let's change. There were just a few referrals to Open Exchange, useful tools that you can use as well. And I think we'll just also take all the recommendations from the chat and post them together with recording, so all people can use these links too. Yeah, looks all answered. If for any chance we missed your questions, could you please just post it again in the chat?
I think we've covered everybody at this point.
Nice. Great.
We can ask if the audience who is using unit test, if you just thumbs up if you do.
Or you can just type class in the chat if you use.
No, or if you will after this roundtable.
Nice.
All right, and if you have questions on unit testing, you can always reach out on the post on the developer community. I'll kind of keep an eye out.
Yes,
as
so
always.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. So just to wrap
Оля,
up, I will post the recording. I will also add all the links in the same post so you can use them. And if you still have questions, I will tag Tim there. Just submit your questions in the comment sections to that post, and we'll make sure to have them covered. Okay? Evgeny, sorry, did you wanted to comment anything?
yeah. Actually, I have a question that relates to the unit testing for interoperability productions. What are the best practices to unit test different elements of the production, like processes, services, operations, then rules, and things like that? Yeah, but I think this deserves an additional session or post or whatever. It might just my general comment is unit test is fantastic. It's always a recommendation use just to decrease the level of stress in a developer's life. Yeah, it would be great to have robust approaches for interoperability. And the biggest comment is, Tim, thank you so much for such a fantastic session and test coverage tool you introduced. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much to offer on the interoperability side, but always open to learning and trying to adapt things that I do know to that.
Yeah, maybe someone from the audience has the wide experience with unit testing of interoperability productions. I don't know, Scott, maybe you have. So it would be great if you can share. It would be fantastic. Yeah.
Unit test wise, we don't use the unit test wise built-in functionality. We mostly test. We have our clinical users actually create messages from our EMR, and we send them to whatever, and have the vendor verify that the messages look according to their specifications. So I mean, we have not used unit testing in the past. We've done our own type of unit testing where we involve the users and make sure that they go through the proper workflows to make sure that the vendors are getting what they should. Sorry about that. I mean, that's the way, because I mean, you could, interoperability wise, you could create a standard set of messages that you could run through. But the data from the sending systems are always changing. So
yeah, that is what we have done on our side. And that was my question actually. So what we have done is we have predefined set of accepted values for an HL7 coming in for like patient
for 4 hours of
patient admits, and then we manually run through. So like a new integration comes in, we manually run through all the test cases. So I was wondering if there is a way we can have something built in. Well, if there's none, then there is a ways we could do it. Like you just have to do the heavy lifting.
Right. I mean, I understand that, and I've seen ideas post earlier.
Yeah, this is.
I was going to say I've seen ideas posted. It's very hard to capture exactly the exact messages. Like, I know there's ideas been posted about what about an auto-generated HL7, a way to auto-generate HL7 within Iris. But yeah, we normally just test. We have, because we use Epic, we have our Prelude team or Grand Central team just run through a bunch of registrations and make sure that the messages generate and they're sent to downstream systems. And then if we're testing with that downstream system, we have them review them. So.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was going to say I've actually started setting up unit tests using the unit test package for feeds, kind of a combination of that Open Exchange rule set. solution and had to tweak it a little bit, but the goal, we're still in the beginning, sort of dev phases, but the goal was to set up sample messages, which you can use, you can set up within Xdata blocks and then feed it in within the unit test within Xdata blocks, and then have a packaged unit test that goes with the feed. And we've been able to successfully kind of regression test with it as data changes, and also like a smoke test as we deploy to stage. And so that's why I wanted to join this call. I'm very pleased with, just sort of the pain point that was in the past for regression testing, how it really looks like we might be able to automate quite a bit of it. But as I mentioned, it's sort of in dev still, but I'm really interested in sort of a way to package this together in a best practices sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if, if we could just, I mean, I don't know.
Maybe I can share. Oh, you know what? Maybe I can share some of what we're doing. And it's we would definitely love to streamline it more.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm really looking into templify the process right now. So.
Right. I mean,
That'd be fantastic.
If you post it out on the developer community, you might get some more feedback on it too.
Yeah,
so
that would be amazing.
Well, if I may add, I have a lot of experience on interoperability, and I doubt there is a single solution for interoperability unit test. What we normally do during development and then future in the testing is just to set up the best possible scenario to test an interface that involves sometimes just a simple postman, or for HL7 maybe a dummy production that sent sample or test HL7 message to a new business service. Then the result maybe is stored in a final bound adapter. But there are many different cases. I mean, you have SOAP, you have HL7, you have REST, you have SQL, you have, and that's the reason why.
And if you're doing X12 through your engine too, so.
Right. Yeah. FTP, so many.
Right.
That's another reason why, for example, client-side development, the team is so passionate about it, just doesn't work on interoperability environment. You cannot have on your machine a similar environment of an interoperability system with, I don't know, 50, 100 interfaces.
Well, yeah, I mean,
locally?
Load testing is, you wouldn't be able to ever load test at all.
Right, and it doesn't make sense to have a copy of all that on your machine. I mean, that's why server-side developing is the norm on many, I'm not saying all, but at least in large interoperability environment. That's the only option, let's face it.
Right.
And at the beginning of the VS Code introduction, that was all oriented to local file system editing. I think it was missing what the many customers were doing during development. Now it's getting better, but anyway, going back to unit test, I don't think there is a solution to automate.
I mean, everybody's going to have a different way of doing things, and there's not going to be an overarching all solution for HL7. I mean, you could set up a unit test, say, okay, I want to test admits, or I want to test discharges, or I want to test whatever API that you've created. But there's never going to be an overall arching solution at all. But I mean, at least we could get some kind of basic solution. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but majority of my interfaces are, I mean, a lot of people's are still HL7 2, 2.3 or 2.5, whatever version of 2 it is. And so I mean, you could create a basic set of HL7.2 messages that you could sit there and write a routing rule to say, okay, the vendor only wants these. Here's the DTL that I created for that vendor. Send them through, you know, make sure it passes. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, the other thing I would like to see is some kind of like de-identifying tool. I mean, that'd be great, because I don't know about you guys, but we write a lot of stuff out to files because we don't keep a lot in the database. So we have files going back over a year of ADT data. And if we could take that from a prod environment and de-identify it because they're prod patients, we can't send prod medical records across
Yeah,
in a test environment.
There was
That'd
an
be great.
there was an open source project about de-identifying HL7s and in messages in general. I can post a link for that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So from a pure unit testing perspective, I'd imagine the units that you're interested in testing would be DTLs and maybe just routing rules. So
For the most part, I mean, I know my case where, and people can tell you, I build a lot of BPLs because we
Okay.
do a lot with SQL. But I think for the most part, for the majority of people, it would be DTLs and routing rules.
So I think having a template those on the call, what, like X, when you hear X data block, do you know what that means from an ObjectScript perspective?
It's just the way that we just display it within the trace, isn't it, Tim?
So, and no, well, what an X data block would be is, let me just get rid of this. We'll say X data input.
Okay, yeah, I've done this
X
before
data
with
output.
operations, yeah.
And foo bar equals 25. You just put some XML in there. Number value equals 5. And then from a unit testing perspective, what I would do for something like this is, and of course this would be something way more complicated. So from a test perspective, I'd say method test transformation and say set input equal to compound class percent dictionary dot x data definition dot id key open class name input set output or expected output equal to compound class percent dictionary dot x data definition dot id key open class name output. And then each of these has a data, yeah, this could be all sorts of different formats. Each of these has a stream in it. So I would say, set real output equal to, compound class, some class dot do the transformation on input. And these would all be streams. So then I'd say set file1 equal to compound class percent stream dot temp character dot percent new, do file1 dot copy from and save real out, or we'll say out file, real output file. We'll give these descriptive names. And then set expected output file equal to compound class percent stream dot temp character dot percent new. Once these are saved, actually, I think I'd use file character and set move on close equal to 1. And then here I would say expected output dot data. Data is the stream that has the actual content of this. And then assert file same real output file dot file name expected file dot file name. And then you could imagine templating something like this to say, this is a test of a transformation. You have a base unit test class that tests transformation. This part would vary based on class parameters. The input and output would differ for each subclass. But I could see if you're going to do just kind of the normal ObjectScript unit testing of things like transformations and business rules, that kind of thing. This would be the general approach.
Okay, yeah, yeah, makes sense.
I know we'll do things like this even just for well, I don't need to go. We're definitely out of time at this point. X data blocks, super useful. That's how they work in a unit test, is the main point.
Thank you, Tim. So let's wrap up. I see people are dropping off already. Thanks a lot. We received a lot of thanks from those who already had to go, and I will post everything on DC, and let's connect there. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks, Tim.